On the morning of my 16th birthday, I woke up in what I thought was my home, the kind of place with polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and oil paintings of dead ancestors who never smiled. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that always meant something was coming. My bedroom door, which I was never allowed to lock, creaked open around 8 a.m., and there stood my father, Frank, in his usual blazer and iron slacks like he was about to close a deal, not destroy what was left of my world. He didn't say happy birthday. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at me like I had failed him in some deep, unredeemable way. Then he dropped a thin envelope on my bed. I already knew what it was before my fingers even touched the paper. The last rejection letter. It wasn't enough that I'd gotten into 4 excellent schools most kids would kill for, but none of them were Ivy League, and that, to Frank, meant I had wasted 16 years of resources, as he once called them. Resources. That was his word for piano lessons, private tutors, tennis camps in the summer, and those hellish winter breaks spent at prep intensives instead of seeing family or friends. I read the letter silently, even though I didn't need to. I had memorized the rejection email from Princeton the moment it had arrived 2 days earlier. Frank just stared at me, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Then he told me to get up and pack my things. I thought I had misheard. I blinked at him, waiting for him to explain that he meant I needed to pack for some surprise trip or maybe for boarding school, but no. "You're not staying here anymore," he said. His voice was flat, but his eyes were mean. "We had a deal. Ivy or out." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. My chest tightened like I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then I whispered, "It's my birthday." He didn't flinch. He didn't even look away. He just said, "Exactly." I didn't have time to argue. He had already summoned the housekeeper, Maria, to bring up a suitcase, one of the old ones, not even mine, and he started tossing things into it himself. Clothes. My laptop. A half-used notebook. No charger. No phone. He even took my backpack and dumped it out on the bed before deciding it was too nice to let me keep. By the time I got downstairs, the suitcase was already waiting for me at the bottom of the marble staircase. I stood at the top, frozen. My father was in the foyer, arms behind his back like he was reviewing some kind of business decision. My stepmom, Janice, leaned against the doorway in her silk robe, a glass of something pink and bubbly in her hand at 10 in the morning. She didn't even try to hide her smirk. She had never liked me, never tried to. She used to tell me that I was too plain to be from money and that my posture made me look like I was apologizing for existing. Today, she was practically glowing, diamonds at her neck catching the morning light as if she'd dressed up just to watch me fall. And my sister, Harper, of course she had to be there. She was 21 and home from Yale for the holidays. She looked me up and down with that trademark sneer she used whenever I tried to speak at family dinners. "Guess state school wasn't part of Dad's legacy plan," she said, fake pouting. "Tough break, loser." No one stopped me as I stood there, humiliated, trying not to cry. I had never felt so small, so disposable. I was still barefoot, still in my pajamas. I took a step down, then another, and when I reached the bottom, I noticed something that made it worse. The suitcase wasn't even zipped up properly. My things were spilling out onto the cold floor, and no one had bothered to fix it. Frank just gestured toward the door like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Outside, it was cold, snow on the ground, sky gray, air sharp enough to bite skin. I didn't have a coat. I didn't have gloves. I didn't even have my wallet. My phone had been confiscated 2 weeks earlier as motivation to study harder. They didn't give it back. I turned around, one last time, thinking maybe he would come to his senses, say this was all some horrible lesson, a test of loyalty or grit. But Frank didn't move. Janice raised her glass in a mock toast. Harper actually waved. I stepped outside with nothing but that half-closed suitcase and whatever money I had hidden in my sock drawer, which was now somewhere back in that house, probably in the trash. I didn't even know where to go. No one had ever taught me how to take the bus. I had never had a friend over, let alone someone I could run to. I stood there in the driveway of our gated Denver estate, the cold settling into my bones, knowing for the first time in my life that I was truly, completely alone. The sun had barely risen when I found myself sitting on a metal park bench, hunched over with my arms wrapped tightly around my knees, trying to hold in what little warmth I had left. My thin pajama pants clung to my legs, stiff with frost, and the soles of my feet burned from alternating between numbness and sharp bursts of pain every time I shifted. The suitcase I had dragged for 2 miles was parked beside me, half open, the contents inside barely enough to insulate a rabbit, let alone a human being stranded in December in Denver with no coat, no gloves, and no idea what to do next. I had wandered aimlessly for hours after being thrown out, my fingers turning red, then blue, and finally a dull, sickly white. I didn't cry anymore, not because I had stopped wanting to, but because even my tears had frozen before they could fall. The park was nearly deserted. A few early joggers passed by, bundled in fleece and headphones, barely casting me a glance. One woman slowed slightly, then turned her head sharply forward as though the sight of me might infect her with my failure. I had stopped expecting help. People didn't want to see misery up close, it was too awkward, too raw. It reminded them that comfort was always conditional. I had leaned back against the bench, my spine pressing against the icy metal slats, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, when I noticed her approaching. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, the way it rolled in off the frozen pond in thick white sheets, swallowing sound and shape alike. But then the figure took form, small, hunched, and moving slowly, as if each step weighed more than the last. Her hair was long and white, tangled like uncombed threads of yarn spilling over her shoulders. She wore no shoes, bare feet against ice and concrete, and her ankles were purplish, swollen, and cracked like dry leather. Her coat, if it could be called that, was a frayed wool thing, more holes than fabric, tied at the waist with a piece of electrical cord. Her hands trembled as she walked, one palm stretched out slightly, not in a begging gesture, more like someone reaching for a wall in the dark. She stopped a few feet in front of me and tilted her head slightly to the side. Her eyes were blue, not the soft kind, but piercing, like ice under pressure. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse and dry. She asked me if I knew of a shelter nearby, said she had been walking all night, that the last place had turned her away. There was no desperation in her tone, just a tiredness so profound it cut through the cold like a knife. I looked down at her feet, bluish at the toes, the nails long and brittle, her skin stretched too tight over bones that shouldn't have been exposed. She must have seen my eyes flicker to her feet, because she gave a half smile, more from habit than humor, and said it wasn't so bad once the numbness set in. I didn't even think before I moved. I bent down and unzipped my boots, thick, fur-lined, brand new. They still smelled like the store. My dad had bought them a week before, probably just to keep up appearances at the country club, where he liked to pretend we were a normal family. I slipped them off slowly, biting back the hiss that came when the freezing air hit my damp socks. Then I held them out to her. She blinked, surprised, and her eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to see whether I was serious. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She hesitated only for a moment before sitting down slowly beside me and slipping the boots on. They were big on her, clunky, but she laced them with shaking hands and nodded once when she stood again, testing the feel of them. Her voice was softer this time when she said thank you, and I could tell it had been a long time since anyone had shown her kindness that didn't come with terms. Then, as the fog thickened again, she leaned toward me and whispered something under her breath. I couldn't catch all of it. Her voice cracked in the middle, part of it buried by the wind, but I heard the word return and something about being seen. I wanted to ask her to repeat it, but by the time I turned my head, she was already walking away, her figure swallowed by the mist like it had never been there at all. I sat there barefoot, the bench colder than ever, my socks soaked through and clinging to my feet like paper. But I didn't move. Not for a long time. The pain in my toes came sharper now, more insistent, but I still watched the fog where she had vanished, unable to shake the feeling that something important had just happened, though I couldn't quite name what. It couldn't have been more than an hour later, though time had started to feel irrelevant, dissolving into the cold like breath into fog. I was still on that bench, barefoot now, my toes burning with pain and numbness, switching back and forth like they couldn't decide whether to freeze or throb. I was hugging my knees again, my chin resting on top of them, too drained to think, too cold to cry, when I heard the sound, barely more than a whisper at first, low and smooth, like a breeze brushing over pavement. Then it grew louder, a hum building with precision and rhythm, until I finally raised my head, blinking through the mist and the tears that hadn't fallen. At first, it didn't register. The fog began to thin slightly, parting just enough to reveal flashes of red, then metal, then light. I sat up straighter, instinctively tensing as 20 identical cars emerged from the whiteness in a perfectly synchronized line. Red BMWs, bright, polished, not a fleck of dirt on them despite the icy slush on the streets. They rolled up silently, almost eerily, in a slow, deliberate motorcade, the engines too smooth to growl, moving like they were gliding on tracks. I counted them without meaning to. 20. All the same model, same color, same tinted windows, same blacked-out rims gleaming with frost. They came to a halt directly across from the bench, their symmetry flawless, doors staying shut, engines idling as if waiting for a signal. Then, from the center car, the 10th one, came movement. The back passenger door opened, not rushed, not hesitant. Just, planned. Intentional. And from its depth the same woman I had met earlier. Or at least, that's who I thought she was. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing because she didn't look like the barefoot, trembling figure I had handed my boots to not long ago. She stood tall now, radiant, wrapped in a full-length black coat that shimmered with a satin sheen, the collar trimmed with real fur, not the cheap kind but the type you only saw in magazines or behind glass on Fifth Avenue. Around her neck were layered diamonds, dozens of them, set in platinum, catching the cold sunlight and throwing it back in shards of ice and fire. Her hair, once wild and tangled, was now sculpted into smooth, silver waves that framed her face with an almost regal perfection. Her skin no longer looked raw or wind-chapped, but luminous, the kind of glow that couldn't be faked, no matter how many creams you used. She took slow, graceful steps toward me, her heels clicking softly against the frozen path, the fog curling around her ankles like it was bowing to her. She didn't shiver. She didn't even seem to feel the cold. People like her didn't just walk through parks in the winter, let alone barefoot and freezing. I stared, unable to move, every inch of me confused and raw and painfully aware of how broken and exposed I must have looked, curled on that bench with nothing but wet socks and a half-zipped suitcase of useless things. She stopped directly in front of me, standing just close enough that I could see the reflection of my own face in her diamond necklace, my red eyes, cracked lips, pale skin. And then she spoke. Her voice was nothing like before. It wasn't hoarse or dry. It was smooth, low, and commanding, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who never had to repeat herself. She looked me dead in the eye, no smile, no pity, no performative warmth, and said, "I've been watching you. I know exactly who you are." She didn't blink. She didn't look away. And for a moment, it felt like the entire world had gone still, no wind, no noise, no breath. Just her eyes locked on mine, and that sentence, hanging in the air like it carried weight I couldn't yet understand. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't speak at all, actually, not even when she gestured for me to follow her into the red BMW, the door held open by a man in a black coat who never said a word and never looked directly at me. My legs were trembling from the cold, every step a shock of pain up my calves, but I forced myself to move, gripping the side of the doorframe as I slid into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and leather, warm and impossibly soft, so far removed from everything I had touched in the last 24 hours that I could hardly process it. Harriet, because that was her name, though I didn't know it yet, sat beside me, calm and composed, her posture perfect, hands resting in her lap, fingers lined with rings that caught the dim winter light and scattered it like ice through crystal. The door shut with a soft click, the driver returned to his seat, and without a single word exchanged, we began to move. The convoy followed, each car perfectly spaced, engines humming in quiet synchrony as we wound through the city, leaving behind the cracked sidewalks, frozen benches, and all the places I had never really belonged to begin with. I stared out the tinted window, watching as familiar landmarks gave way to industrial zones, then empty highway, then thick forests heavy with snow and mist. No one explained where we were going. No GPS spoke. No music played. It was just silence, velvet silence, the kind that muffled your thoughts and slowed your heart. Hours must have passed before the convoy turned onto a narrow road, unmarked and unlit, that curved up into the hills. The fog had lifted by then, and the trees grew taller, older, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some ancient cathedral. We drove higher and higher until the city lights disappeared completely and the stars returned, sharp and bright against the deep blue sky. Finally, the trees opened up, and we passed through tall iron gates that creaked but didn't groan, sweeping open in absolute silence as though they'd been oiled daily for a century. The estate itself sat nestled between the ridges of two hills, hidden from view by design. It was massive, but not gaudy. Built of deep stone and dark wood, it looked less like a mansion and more like an old-world fortress redesigned with modern taste. The driveway curved around a frozen fountain, the ice catching light from low garden lanterns that flickered like fireflies. There were no guards, no security cameras visible, yet I knew immediately that this place was more secure than any house I had ever stepped foot in. It wasn't just a home, it was a world of its own, cut off from everything else. When we stepped out of the car, Harriet walked ahead, and I followed her, unsure if I was supposed to speak or wait or somehow disappear into the background. She led me through tall doors carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize, through a foyer that smelled like sandalwood and something faintly floral, past hallways lined with abstract paintings and walls of glass looking out onto snow-covered courtyards. The staff inside moved with the same quiet precision as the drivers, unobtrusive, efficient, almost invisible. Someone handed me a thick wool blanket and a pair of slippers without saying a word, and I took them with numb fingers, too overwhelmed to thank them properly. It wasn't until we reached a sitting room, huge stone fireplace, books lining the walls, windows stretching from floor to ceiling, that she finally sat down and gestured for me to do the same. A fire crackled softly in front of us, casting gold light across her face as she unfastened her coat and leaned back, her gaze still fixed on me with that same unsettling intensity. "My name is Harriet Monroe," she said, her voice calm but firm, like she was used to people listening when she spoke. "I own Monroe Industries. We develop sustainable energy systems for government and private sectors. Last fiscal year, we generated $41 billion in net profit. I also run a private foundation, anonymous, entirely off-record, that funds a series of social experiments and recovery programs for displaced youth." I nodded slowly, still trying to make sense of it all, my mouth dry, words caught in my throat. She tilted her head slightly, watching me, then continued. "Every December," she said, "I run a test. One I created myself. I go out into the streets as someone invisible, discarded, forgotten. I want to see who will help when there's nothing to gain. Most people don't even look at me. Some pretend not to hear. Others walk faster. One woman last year kicked snow at me for blocking her path." She looked into the fire, pausing briefly. "But you," she said, finally turning back toward me. "You gave me the only thing you had of value. Your boots. The same boots your father bought you. The same boots that were probably supposed to keep you warm after he threw you out." She didn't ask if it was true. She already knew. Somehow, she knew everything. "You passed," she said simply. "Not because you were generous. Not because you were kind. But because you gave without expecting anything. That's rare." I sat in stunned silence, the heat of the fire slowly starting to chase the numbness from my limbs, though inside I still felt frozen. Harriet didn't speak again for a while. She let the moment hang, let it settle, as if she knew I needed time to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. That night, in that impossible house on a hidden estate in Northern California, wrapped in a stranger's blanket with firelight on my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not comfort exactly, but the faint, uncertain edge of safety. And for the first time since I had been pushed out of that marble mansion and onto the street, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. I felt seen. The silence between us had settled into something dense but not uncomfortable, like the air before a storm, charged with the weight of something irreversible. Harriet didn't shift in her chair or lean forward to make a point, she simply sat there, composed and still, her eyes locked on mine with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer now but carried the same underlying power, as if every syllable had been measured, chosen for impact. "I'm offering you something that will change your life," she said, her fingers gently folding in her lap, rings catching the flicker of the firelight. "Not because I pity you. Not because I want to rescue you. I don't believe in rescuing people. I believe in arming them." She leaned back slightly, letting that statement land, and I felt a strange pulse of heat in my chest, something sharp and new pushing up through the cold exhaustion. She explained that what she was offering wasn't charity, it was a contract, a mission, a path that required discipline, resilience, and unshakable integrity. 5 years under her direct mentorship. 5 years of rigorous academic training, practical leadership development, and full access to resources most people never even dream of. I would receive an elite private education, one-on-one instruction in ethics, business strategy, and philanthropy, along with room and board on the estate. But none of it would come easy. It would be demanding. Exhausting. Non-negotiable. And if I failed to live up to the standards she laid out, not academically, but morally, it would end. No second chances. No excuses. Then she told me the real reason she had chosen me. She said the foundation she had built, privately, quietly, and entirely outside the public eye, was not just a machine for giving money. It was a weapon against cruelty, corruption, and neglect. It sought out the people the system discarded, and rebuilt them not with handouts, but with purpose. Harriet had always intended to pass it on, but only to someone who understood what it meant to have nothing. Someone who had bled, who had been humiliated, frozen, and rejected, not just by family, but by a world that measured worth in prestige and pedigree. If you make it through, she said, you'll inherit not only the foundation, but the responsibility of shaping who it serves, how it grows, and what kind of legacy it leaves behind. She didn't dress it up with sentimentality. She didn't try to dazzle me with promises. She just looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't a gift. It's an obligation. You don't owe me gratitude. You owe me excellence." I sat there frozen, not from the cold anymore, but from the magnitude of what she was offering. My body was still trembling, my limbs heavy with exhaustion and half-thawed pain, but beneath all of that was something fiercer, something alive. My fingers curled around the wool blanket pulled tight around my shoulders, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, not with fear, but with something burning. A kind of fire I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. A fire that came from the realization that someone had finally seen me not as a disappointment, not as a burden, not as a failed investment, but as a force. A future. I didn't try to stand. I didn't clear my throat or ask a million questions. I simply looked at her, straight into those unflinching, brilliant eyes, and nodded. My voice cracked when I said the word, but I meant it with every raw, bruised part of me, yes. It didn't feel like salvation. It felt like armor. The next morning, the transformation began, not of my circumstances, but of who I was at the core, and it started with the sound of a knock on my door at exactly 5:30 a.m. It wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made it clear hesitation wouldn't be tolerated. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every muscle in my body still sore from the previous days of cold and shock, and pulled on the workout gear that had been laid out on a chair the night before, black thermal leggings, a long-sleeved compression shirt, and trail shoes that looked like they belonged to a soldier, not a teenager. By 6 a.m., I was outside, lungs filling with crisp mountain air, heart pounding in my chest as I stood in formation with 3 other trainees, all older than me, all hardened in ways I couldn't yet name. Our instructor was a former Marine, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because his presence did the shouting. He gave no introduction, no welcome speech. Just a curt nod and the words, "We run until you stop breaking." And we did. Every morning began the same, sprints through frozen dirt trails that twisted up the hillside, bodyweight circuits in gravel lots, and cold plunges in steel tanks to shock our systems into resilience. I thought I had known discomfort before, but this was something else entirely. There were no shortcuts. No good job pats on the back. Harriet didn't believe in praise unless it was earned through sweat and discipline. The mornings tore through me, broke the parts of me that had clung to victimhood, and replaced them with something leaner, sharper, unshakable. After the runs came the classroom. My days were carved into brutal segments, legal theory at 9 a.m., finance and investment analysis at 11 o'clock, nonprofit governance in the afternoon, followed by 3 hours of case studies, simulations, and leadership drills that forced us to think under pressure. We studied the intricacies of tax law, the anatomy of public-private partnerships, donor psychology, corporate ethics, and political lobbying strategies. Every mistake was corrected publicly, but never with humiliation. Harriet demanded accountability, not shame. "This isn't about passing," she told me once after I flubbed a policy analysis. "This is about becoming. There's no grading curve for the people we serve." Dinner was silent unless called upon. We ate fresh, nutrient-dense meals prepared by a rotating kitchen staff, and then it was back to the library, where I read cases and wrote reports until my vision blurred. Lights out was at midnight. There were no phones, no social media, no distractions of any kind. I wasn't expected to act like a teenager, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like one. I was being forged into something entirely different, someone capable of holding weight, of making decisions that could ripple into lives I'd never even meet. But what kept me going, what drove me through the muscle cramps, the brain fog, the aching loneliness of being cut off from the world I had once known, was the memory of my little brother. I hadn't seen him since that morning I was thrown out, his face pale at the top of the staircase, frozen in confusion as our father screamed, as Janice laughed, as Harper turned her back. He had been the only one who didn't participate in my exile, the only one who used to sneak into my room and cry when things got loud downstairs, the only one I'd ever felt responsible for. I didn't know if he was okay. I didn't know what lies he'd been told or what version of me they had painted to justify erasing me from his life. But I did know that I couldn't fail, not just for myself, but because one day, I would go back for him, and I couldn't show up as a broken, angry ghost of who I used to be. I had to become someone powerful, someone capable of taking on a system and dismantling it with precision. So I kept grinding. Through the injuries, through the self-doubt, through the long nights that ended in tears I refused to shed in public. I watched myself change in the mirror, not just physically, but in the set of my jaw, in the stillness of my gaze. I started to speak differently, to hold space in rooms full of people twice my age, to think strategically rather than emotionally. Harriet watched closely, never coddling, always pushing. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to crack the pieces of me that needed breaking. By the end of that first year, I no longer recognized the girl who had sat shivering on a park bench with frostbitten feet and a bruised heart. I didn't have time to grieve who I had been. I had a mission now, and every day was a step toward becoming the weapon I was meant to be. By the time I reached the third year of my apprenticeship, the routine had become second nature, grueling, relentless, but no longer foreign. I had developed a kind of mental callus, a hardened layer of focus that shielded me from distractions, doubts, and the kind of emotional noise that used to derail me. I had grown used to solitude. Not loneliness, exactly, but a quiet self-containment that made it easier to push forward, day after day, toward the goal Harriet had placed before me. I knew what I was there to do, and I knew what it required of me. But everything shifted the day I met Nolan. He wasn't introduced with ceremony. He simply appeared one afternoon during a policy roundtable in Harriet's private library, a weekly discussion she reserved for her most advanced apprentices. I remember the moment clearly, the glass doors opening softly, Harriet looking up from her notes, her eyes softening just slightly as he entered the room. He was taller than I expected, lean but not angular, with a quietness about him that didn't read as insecurity. It was something else, something self-assured, like someone who had spent his life observing more than speaking. His hair was dark, slightly unkempt in a way that suggested he'd been focused on something more important than appearances, and his eyes, gray, sharp, and oddly gentle, moved around the room with quick intelligence before briefly landing on me. Harriet's tone changed when she spoke to him. Not warmer, not maternal, but marked with a rare softness, a kind of unspoken familiarity that no one else could pull from her. "This is Nolan," she said simply, as though that explained everything. "He's joining the foundation this quarter." It was weeks before I learned he was her grandnephew. He never used the connection to gain status, never leveraged his name or lineage. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid the spotlight, showing up early, sitting in the back of the room, always listening, always taking notes. He had a mind for systems, complex, layered ideas that most people found too dense to engage with. He'd make a single comment during a 3-hour seminar, but it would always be the kind of insight that changed the direction of the conversation entirely. He didn't speak unless it added weight. I respected that deeply, almost immediately. At first, we interacted only within the framework of our work, co-leading presentations, drafting proposals for microgrant pilots, and late-night brainstorming sessions in the strategy room with cups of black coffee and annotated printouts spread across long tables. But over time, something shifted. It was subtle. A second longer of eye contact across the conference room. A smirk exchanged over some bureaucratic absurdity in a grant application. An unspoken rhythm forming between us, a shared understanding of the stakes, of what we were trying to build. He never looked at me the way others sometimes did, with pity, or awe, or hesitation. He looked at me like I was an equal. Like I belonged. One night, we stayed behind after a full day of fieldwork in Oakland, reviewing data from a new initiative targeting youth reentry programs. We sat on the floor of one of the temporary offices, laptops dimmed, eating reheated lentils from biodegradable containers, both too tired to pretend we weren't human. I remember he glanced over at me, his expression unreadable, and said, "You know, I used to think resilience was just survival with better PR. But you've made it into something else." I didn't know how to respond, not right away. My throat tightened unexpectedly, and I hated how raw I felt in that moment, seen, exposed, but in a way that didn't hurt. That was the night everything between us changed. Not with a grand gesture or dramatic confession, but with quiet acknowledgement, mutual respect softening into something more human, more personal. From that point on, he became part of my life in a way that no one else had managed to penetrate. He was there when the weight got heavy. When I doubted myself, when the pressure of legacy and purpose threatened to crush the version of me I had fought so hard to build, he grounded me, not by fixing anything, but by simply being present, unflinching, consistent. We never needed to explain ourselves to each other. Our connection wasn't built on romantic cliches or the kind of urgency that fades. It was layered, slow, deliberate, built in the margins between high-stakes meetings, emergency budget revisions, and the kind of personal growth that left no room for superficiality. He became the person I could sit with in silence and feel understood. The one who didn't flinch when I spoke about my brother, or the ache that never fully left me no matter how many milestones I reached. The one who never treated me like a success story, or a symbol, or a survivor. Just a person. Just me. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony or labels, he became mine. It started with a single question, the kind that grows slowly in the back of your mind and refuses to go quiet no matter how much progress you've made or how far you've come: why did they really throw me out? For years, I had accepted the answer they gave me, or rather, the excuse. That I had failed. That I hadn't lived up to the standards of the family, that not getting into an Ivy League school was an unforgivable betrayal of the investment they claimed to have made in me. But that narrative had never fully made sense. It had been too sudden, too brutal, too complete. Parents might yell, they might threaten, they might withhold love, but they didn't typically strip a child of everything, throw them into the cold, and vanish. Not over a college rejection. Especially not when they had the resources to fix almost anything. And once that doubt took root, I couldn't ignore it. At the foundation, I had access to tools that most people didn't even know existed, databases that peeled back layers of corporate and personal finance like tissue paper, investigators with backgrounds in federal intelligence, forensic accountants, and software that could track movement through networks in ways most government agencies would envy. Harriet didn't impose restrictions on what I could use as long as I made a case for its relevance. And so I did. I filed a research proposal under an internal audit training module and quietly began collecting data. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. My father, Frank, who had spent decades cultivating the image of a cold but competent financial patriarch, had made a catastrophic mistake that he never recovered from. 3 months before he threw me out, he had quietly liquidated a substantial portion of our family trust, a structure that had existed since my grandfather's time, supposedly untouchable, to cover a series of investment losses tied to a biotech startup out of Austin. On paper, the deal looked clean, until I followed the money trail further and realized it wasn't just a bad investment. It was a shell company created by none other than Harper's fiancé, a man who had never held a legitimate job, who had changed his legal name twice, and who had a sealed record in 2 states. The startup had collapsed within 6 weeks of the payout, and all the capital, over $12 million, was gone. Untraceable. Except it wasn't. Using a private ledger trace from one of our partner firms, I uncovered that the money had been rerouted through a chain of accounts in the Caymans, then withdrawn in chunks through private banking services registered under aliases that connected directly back to Harper's fiancé's legal birth name. Frank hadn't been protecting family wealth. He had been covering up a scandal that would have not only bankrupted him, but disgraced the family socially and financially. And more than that, he had needed someone to absorb the attention, someone to play the role of the problem child, the disappointment, the distraction. But it didn't stop there. Janice, my stepmother, who had always treated me with thinly veiled contempt, had been doing more than sipping wine and sneering at my posture. For years, she had been diverting funds from a joint charitable venture that she and Frank operated as a tax shelter, a donor-advised fund that was supposed to support children's hospitals in Colorado. Through a shell management company, she had been issuing false invoices for event planning, routing tens of thousands of dollars each quarter to a consultancy firm owned by a man she was romantically involved with. I found photos, timestamped, geotagged, pulled from public image data harvested from anonymous devices. Weekends in Aspen. A hidden condo in Manhattan paid for with the foundation's funds. Airline tickets purchased under pseudonyms. All traceable. All damning. The full picture came together like a slow-moving storm. I had always believed I'd been expelled from that house because I had failed to meet expectations, because I hadn't been good enough to fit the mold they demanded. But the truth was uglier. They hadn't thrown me out for failing, they had thrown me out because they were already failing, and they needed someone to blame, someone defenseless and young enough not to question it. A 16-year-old girl with no power, no money, and no voice. I had been the perfect scapegoat. I sat alone for a long time the night I finished compiling the report, dozens of pages, cross-referenced, bulletproof. I hadn't cried in years, not from pain or shame or even anger. But that night, it wasn't grief I felt. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, unforgiving clarity. Everything I had believed about my own worth, everything they had tried to bury me under, it had all been projection, all misdirection. Their guilt, their secrets, their cowardice. And in exposing them, I wasn't just uncovering the truth. I was reclaiming every piece of myself they had tried to erase. It happened exactly 4 years to the day since I'd been thrown out of that marble mansion in Denver with nothing but a half-packed suitcase and a name that carried no weight. 4 years since I stood barefoot on a frozen sidewalk, exiled from a home that had never truly been mine, told I was worthless, a disappointment, a liability. And now here they were, my father, my stepmother, and my sister, standing on the other side of the glass wall in the 12th floor lobby of my foundation's headquarters in San Francisco, waiting to be let in. The receptionist didn't recognize them, of course. To her, they were just 3 vaguely polished but visibly unraveling people in tailored clothing that didn't quite hide the fatigue behind their eyes or the desperation they tried to disguise as urgency. When I saw them on the security feed, I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel fear. I felt nothing at all. I pressed the button to let them through. The office they walked into was all glass, steel, and warm wood, modern, clean, intentional. It had been designed to reflect clarity, not wealth. Transparency, not power. I had fought for every inch of it, had overseen every detail from the sustainable furniture to the reclaimed timber in the walls. It was mine in a way nothing they had ever owned could compare to. I didn't stand when they entered. I didn't offer them coffee or small talk. I simply gestured toward the 3 chairs across from my desk and waited as they sat, awkwardly, eyes darting around like they weren't sure whether to feel impressed or ashamed. Frank looked older. Not just older in the way men age, but diminished, his once iron posture now slightly collapsed at the shoulders, a visible tremor in his right hand as he tried to maintain composure. Janice wore a designer coat I recognized from a 5-year-old collection, the edges frayed slightly at the sleeves, her makeup applied too heavily to mask the tension in her jaw. Harper, for all her practiced confidence, kept her eyes low, scanning the room like she wanted to find an exit before she said a word. It was Frank who finally spoke. "We're in a difficult position," he said, voice clipped, too formal. "There's been a cascade of issues. Legal, financial. You've probably seen some of the coverage." I had. They had been named in a civil RICO suit 2 months earlier, tied to a network of fraudulent investments, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The SEC had launched an investigation. Their accounts had been frozen. Their properties were under lien. And the trust fund, the one they had gutted to cover Harper's fiancé's fraudulent startup, was now the centerpiece of a class action lawsuit filed by former investors. They were broke. And now they were here, asking for $5 million. He said the number plainly, like it was a formality. Like I might reach into a drawer and write a check. Janice didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was her strategy. Harper looked up then, and for a moment, I thought she might apologize. But she didn't. She said, "We know you're in a position to help. You've done well for yourself." I kept my face still, my body calm. I didn't interrupt. I waited until they were done. And then I spoke. "You're not here because I've done well," I said quietly. "You're here because you failed. Because you made decisions driven by ego, by greed, by fear, and now you're facing the consequences." Frank started to protest, to lean forward, to launch into some rationalization, but I raised one hand and he stopped. I opened a folder on the desk and slid a stack of documents toward them, court filings, bank statements, public records, every detail of the mess they had built and buried me to protect. "You didn't kick me out because I wasn't good enough," I said. "You kicked me out because you needed a distraction. A scapegoat. Someone to absorb the shame of what you'd already done. You fed me to the wolves so you could buy yourselves a few more months of illusion." Janice's face hardened then, but it was brittle, like a mask starting to crack. "You're asking me for $5 million, I continued, voice steady. "But you're not getting a cent. Not because I'm angry. Not because I want revenge. but because what you're experiencing isn't injustice, it's gravity. It's cause and effect. You taught me that actions have consequences. You just never thought the lesson would apply to you. No one spoke. The silence stretched, long and sharp, the only sound the soft hum of the climate-controlled air and the faint click of the clock behind me. I stood then, not to dramatize the moment, but to signal that it was over. The meeting was done. They were dismissed. I looked each of them in the eye, Frank, who had thrown me out like garbage, Janice, who had smiled as I fell, Harper, who had mocked me on the stairs, and I said nothing more. There was nothing left to explain. They walked out of my office slower than they came in. They didn't speak. They didn't look back. I didn't watch them go out of vindication or triumph. I watched because I needed to see it. The final chapter. The end of the lie they'd wrapped me in for 16 years. They had destroyed themselves long before they turned on me. I had only survived the fallout. And now, standing in the place I had built with the strength they tried to erase, I knew one thing with complete clarity. I had never needed to punish them. The truth did that for me. It was never about the money. Not really. Not the millions they had lost, not the trust fund they had gutted, not the assets frozen by the courts or the offshore accounts they thought no one could trace. Those were symptoms of the disease, not the wound itself. The only thing that had kept me up at night, the only piece of unfinished business that had ever truly mattered, was my little brother. Finn. From the day I was thrown out, his face had haunted me, 8 years old, barefoot in pajamas at the top of the stairs, eyes wide and confused, watching in silence as our father screamed, as Janice sneered, as Harper laughed. He hadn't said a word, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't understand. And I had never been able to explain it to him. I had left without a goodbye, without a promise, with nothing but the hope that maybe, someday, I would have the power to come back for him. That day came 4 years later. By then, everything had changed. I had become what they said I'd never be, capable, strategic, unbreakable. I had built an identity not on revenge but on precision, one that gave me access to people who moved nations, who could ruin reputations with a single well-placed leak. I had the documentation, the bank trails, the wire transfers, the emails. I had surveillance footage, forged expense reports, offshore filings, falsified audits. I had everything. And they knew it. So I arranged one final meeting. Not in my office this time, but in a private legal suite uptown, sterile and windowless, stripped of the elegance they used to hide behind. It was just them, their lawyers, and mine. No cameras. No press. Just documents on the table and a simple offer. I looked Frank in the eyes, his face drawn, the desperation no longer masked, and slid the first folder across the table. It contained a summary of the full case I had compiled against them, not for criminal prosecution, though I could have gone that route, but for public exposure. Pages of embezzlement, financial misrepresentation, illicit fund redirection, and personal scandals so sordid they would collapse what remained of their social standing within days. Then I opened the second folder. Guardianship papers. Legal transfer of custody. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I laid it out clearly, coldly. You sign this, I said, tapping the second folder, and everything in the first folder disappears. No press. No release. No social ruin. You walk away with your silence. I walk away with Finn. Frank looked stunned. Janice paled. Harper muttered something about manipulation and morality, but no one listened. Their lawyer tried to argue, of course, tried to reframe the request as coercion, but the facts were indisputable. My position wasn't built on threats. It was built on truth, on documented abuse, on systemic failure. I could have burned them to the ground with a single phone call. Instead, I gave them a choice. And they took it. Frank signed first. His hand shook as he did it, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Janice signed next, her lips tight, as if biting down on every insult she wanted to hurl. Harper hesitated, but her signature followed, pressed hard into the paper like she wanted to leave a scar. When the last pen was down, I closed the folder, nodded once to my lawyer, and stood. I said nothing else. There was nothing left to be said. Finn was waiting outside, sitting in the back of a black SUV with one of my security advisors beside him. He was older now, 12 and tall for his age, quiet but watchful, his body tense like he didn't believe it was real. When I opened the door, he looked at me for a long moment before whispering, "Is it done?" I nodded. "You're coming home with me." He didn't cry. Neither did I. We just sat there for a few seconds, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the silence. No more shouting. No more locked doors or rules used like weapons. No more shame twisted into discipline. Just air. Just space. Just the beginning of something neither of us had ever truly known. That was the day I realized what my real inheritance was. Not their house, not their name, not the trust fund they'd squandered. It was Finn. His freedom. His chance to grow up without fear. I hadn't saved him out of obligation. I had saved him because he was the only part of that broken, cruel world worth carrying into the future. And now, finally, he was free. I was 20 years old when I stood on the stage that afternoon, the sun sharp and clean above me, a windless sky stretching out behind the towering glass facade of the youth center I had spent nearly 2 years designing from the ground up. There were over 3,000 people gathered on the plaza, some seated, many standing, all facing the wide concrete steps that led to the main entrance, flanked by brushed steel and panels of warm reclaimed wood that caught the light like amber. Journalists were stationed behind their cameras, nonprofit leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with educators, social workers, young adults from every part of the state, and donors in tailored suits who had written checks, some understanding what we were building, others just hoping to be close to whatever was rising here. But I wasn't thinking about any of them when I stepped up to the mic. I was thinking about the 16-year-old girl who had once sat barefoot on a frozen park bench, with cracked lips and nowhere to go. Behind me was 128,000 square feet of space, classrooms, trauma-informed counseling suites, a legal aid clinic, live-in transitional housing units, fully subsidized kitchens, a rooftop garden, and 3 separate wings dedicated to vocational training, arts programs, and community reintegration. Every material used had been selected with care: solar-paneled roofing, hypoallergenic flooring, zero-barrier access. Nothing was for show. Every inch of that space had been built to protect, to uplift, to never let another kid feel what I had felt the night I was discarded like a broken object. When I stepped up to the podium, I didn't bring notes. I had been offered speechwriters. I had been given drafts, teleprompters, press-approved language. I declined them all. What I had to say had been written into me, carved deep by memory and repetition. I placed both hands on the podium, glanced out at the crowd, and started with the truth. I was 16 the day my father threw me out of his house, I said. My voice didn't shake, though my pulse thrummed hard behind my ribs. It was my birthday. There was no warning, no conversation. Just a suitcase thrown down the stairs, and the door closing behind me. No phone. No money. No explanation that made any real sense. I wasn't kicked out because I failed to meet expectations. I was kicked out because I was useful as a scapegoat. Because their lies needed someone to wear the blame. There was no sound from the audience. No coughing, no murmuring, just a silence that held itself around me like a second skin. I ended up on a park bench, in the snow, wearing the last pair of boots I'd ever received from the people who raised me. And when a woman, barefoot, purple with cold, asked if I knew where she could find shelter, I gave them to her. Not because I was good. Not because I had anything else to offer. But because I understood, in that moment, that we are measured not by what we lose, but by what we choose to give when we have nothing. The screen behind me lit up with architectural visuals of the center's interior, renderings turned reality, teens painting murals beside engineers, a kitchen filled with laughter and the clatter of plates, caseworkers kneeling down to greet kids at eye level. This place, I continued, turning slightly to gesture behind me, was built not from wealth, but from memory. Not from guilt, but from clarity. Every wall in this building stands because someone once needed a place like this and didn't have one. And every young person who walks through these doors won't have to prove they're worthy of dignity. They won't have to beg for a second chance. They'll be met with what they should have had from the beginning: safety, respect, and the tools to rebuild. I paused then, because what I had to say next was the most important. I want to tell you something I've learned, I said, voice steady but weighted. Family isn't always the people who share your name. It isn't the bloodline that throws you out when you're inconvenient. Family finds you in the fog. Family is the hand that reaches out when the world goes silent. Family is the person who sees your pain and doesn't turn away. Harriet Monroe found me when I had nothing left. Nolan walked with me through fire and didn't flinch. And my brother, Finn, is free today because real family doesn't leave you behind. The crowd was still silent, but the energy had changed, thicker now, reverent, heavy with the quiet weight of truth. I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize it. I had cried enough in the shadows. Today was not about grief. It was about arrival. I stand here not because I was saved, I said. I stand here because I survived. And because survival, when it's met with purpose, becomes something far greater than resilience. It becomes redemption. I stepped back from the mic. No applause came right away, and I didn't need it. The silence said everything. Behind me, the glass doors opened automatically as the first youth residents prepared to walk in for orientation, their expressions wary but bright, some carrying trash bags, some clutching nothing but folded papers and tightly zipped hoodies. And as I turned to walk with them through the threshold of the place I had built brick by brick from the ashes of everything they tried to break in me, I felt it, not pride, not vengeance, but peace. This was my legacy. Not the past. Not the name they tried to bury me with. But this moment. This space. This freedom. This center was the proof that I had not just survived them, I had outgrown them. And I had brought others with me. I never forgave them. Not because I couldn't, and not because I needed to hold on to the pain, but because forgiveness requires something they never offered, accountability. What they did wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. It was a decision, calculated and cruel, made with clear eyes and quiet hands, and they made it not once, but again and again. They chose their comfort over my safety, their lies over my future. And I stopped waiting for an apology the day I realized I didn't need it. I didn't heal through reconciliation. I healed through evolution. I didn't forgive them, I outgrew them. By the time I was old enough to see it clearly, I understood that their love had always been transactional, and when I could no longer deliver on their expectations, I became expendable. That wasn't a family, it was a system of performance and power, and when I walked away, I dismantled it piece by choosing to never become what they were. Instead, I found something better. Harriet didn't just give me shelter, she gave me a compass. She didn't try to mother me with comfort or softness, but with structure, truth, and unwavering expectation. She gave me the room to fall and the tools to rise. She gave me her name when I had none worth keeping. She never told me what to become, she just asked that I be someone worth following. And slowly, in her silent, steel-edged way, she became the mother I had never known I needed. The kind of mother who demanded excellence, not for her pride, but for my own. Nolan was never a savior. He didn't try to fix what had been broken or wrap it in soft words. He saw me, flawed, angry, focused, scared, and stood beside me anyway. He was there for the late nights, the high-stakes boardrooms, the quiet dinners where we planned whole futures on napkins. He challenged me without ever belittling me, and he believed in the version of me that hadn't even fully arrived yet. He never needed me to prove I was worthy of being loved. He just loved me in the space where I finally believed I could be loved. He became my partner not just in life, but in legacy. And Finn. Finn is everything. He's the heartbeat of it all. I watch him now, safe, learning, laughing in hallways I once imagined only in sketches, and I know that whatever pain I endured, whatever weight I carried, it was worth it. He doesn't flinch when he hears a raised voice. He doesn't apologize for taking up space. He knows what home feels like. He knows he is protected, heard, and seen. And that's what breaks the cycle, not wealth, not exposure, not punishment. Freedom. Stability. Love with no transaction attached. What I built was never about revenge. It was never about shaming them or showing the world that I had made it. It was about proof. Proof that a person discarded and erased could come back not as a mirror of that cruelty, but as its opposite. That someone left out in the cold could return to build warmth for thousands. That I didn't need to win by becoming what they were. I needed to win by becoming everything they were not. Kindness, when applied with consistency and strategy, scales. Empathy, when reinforced with structure and vision, builds empires. And character, quiet, principled, immovable character, outlasts every dollar, every headline, every false legacy built on image instead of truth. I didn't beat them by destroying them. I beat them by refusing to be them.